The note was nailed to the wagon wheel where everyone could read it, every word of it. Clara May Whitlock stood in the gray Montana morning, reading her husband's handwriting in front of 37 witnesses, and not one of them looked away fast enough to spare her the shame. She was too big, he had written, too ugly, too heavy a burden for the journey ahead. And just like that, a man she had followed across 4 states simply vanished into the dark with a woman half her size. But here is what none of those 37 witnesses could have known that morning. The woman standing in the dust, swallowing her grief like broken glass, was not finished. She was just beginning. Drop your city in the comments below. Stay with us until the very end, and watch what happens when you discard a woman made of bedrock. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge when Clara May Whitlock woke to the particular silence that precedes catastrophe. It was not the silence of sleep, nor the held-breath quiet of a winter morning. It was the silence of absence of a space where a body had been and was no longer of warmth, already gone cold in the blankets beside her. She lay still for a long moment inside the covered wagon, her eyes open in the darkness, listening to the creek nearby and the shifting of oxen and the distant, indifferent moan of wind moving across the high grass. She had learned in 34 years of living to read the texture of silence the way a farmer reads the sky. And this silence told her something before her mind was even fully awake to receive it. She sat up slowly. The blanket on Edmund's side of the wagon was folded with a neatness that he had never once applied to it in 11 years of marriage. That small, careful gesture struck her as the cruelest detail of all, as if he had wanted to leave things tidy, as if tidiness might soften the blow. She found the note tucked beneath his folded blanket, weighted down with the brass button that had come loose from his good coat the previous Thursday. She had sewn it back on for him Friday morning. She remembered the particular angle of the needle, the way the firelight had caught the thread. She remembered thinking without particular sentiment that she would always be the one to do this kind of mending, that it was simply the shape of her life. She read the note once in the dark. Then she climbed down from the wagon, walked to the edge of the circle of wagons where the fire had burned to embers, stirred the coals with a stick, and read it again by the light of the flame she coaxed back to life. The words were not complicated. Edmund Whitlock had never been a man of elaborate thought. She is too big, too ugly, and too heavy a burden for the journey ahead. He had gone, the note said, with Margaret Fenn, the young widow from the Fenn wagon who had lost her husband to a fever crossing the Platte River. She is gentle and requires my protection. Clara requires nothing and no one, and that is perhaps the saddest truth of all. Clara read that last line 3 times. She turned it over in her mind the way one probes a sore tooth, with the tongue expecting pain, finding something stranger. He had meant it as a condemnation. She would spend a very long time deciding whether it might also be the truest compliment anyone had ever paid her without intending to. She was still standing at the fire when the Halverson woman came out of her wagon to begin the morning's cooking and found her there. Clara heard the sharp intake of breath, the way the woman's step faltered. She did not turn around. "Clara?" "Mrs." Halverson said, her voice carrying that particular mixture of pity and fascination that is the distinctive sound of someone else's disaster providing morning interest. "Oh, Clara, my dear." "Good morning, Edna," Clara said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. She had not known until that moment that she was capable of it. By the time the wagon train captain, a lean, sun-dried man named Aldous Pratt, came to speak with her, there were already clusters of people talking in low voices at the periphery of her vision. She could feel their eyes, the way you feel heat from a fire, that directional warmth that tells you exactly where the flame is burning without needing to look. Pratt removed his hat. He was a decent man in the limited way that some men are decent, which is to say, he was not actively cruel, but he was also not particularly courageous, and he had a wagon train to move and could not afford complications. He told her with genuine awkwardness that she was of course welcome to continue with the party to the valley, that there were families who might take her on as hired help, that she need not be stranded here. He meant hired help as a kindness. Clara understood that. She also understood what kind of help he meant, understood that she would spend the remainder of the journey as a pair of strong arms belonging to someone else's household sleeping near the fire like a particularly useful piece of equipment, and that every mile of the trail would carry the weight of 37 people who had read that note nailed to the wagon wheel. She thanked him. She told him she would not be continuing. He looked startled. He told her this was the Montana Territory, that winter came early and hard, in this country that a woman alone had no prospect of survival. He said all of this with the particular authority of a man who assumed that the severity of a situation would override a woman's stated preference for it. Clara looked at him steadily. She was a tall woman which people tended to notice first, and powerfully built through the shoulders and back, sturdily proportioned in a way that the fashions of the day did not celebrate, and the West did not yet know what to do with. She had a broad, honest face, dark eyes that were currently as flat and unrevealing as creek stones, and hands that were calloused from 11 years of frontier labor. She was in the frank assessment she had made of herself in the small mirror she kept wrapped in wool inside her trunk. Not a conventionally handsome woman. She had always known this. Edmund had simply been the first person to write it down and nail it to a wheel where the morning sun could illuminate each letter. She told Pratt again without raising her voice that she would not be continuing with the party. She watched his eyes move over her, watched him recalculate. In real time, watched something shift from concern to that faint reflexive relief that people feel when a problem that might have been their responsibility announces that it will not be. He settled his hat back on his head, told her he was sorry, told her the train would be moving by mid-morning, and walked away. Clara stood at the edge of the wagon circle and watched the morning activity around her with a strange, dissociative clarity. She watched Hattie Drummond whisper to her daughter, and both of them glance over. She watched old Cyrus Beale shake his head with the solemn air of a man confirming his pre-existing beliefs about the natural order of hardship. She watched a group of children dart between wagons and a small boy stop and point at her before his mother snatched his hand down and pulled him away. She went back to the wagon, and she sat inside it for 17 minutes. She counted them by the watch that had belonged to her mother, a plain silver thing with no ornamentation, a working woman's watch. She sat inside the wagon, and she breathed, and she felt the full weight of what had happened settle into her chest like river stone, dense and cold and permanent. She gave herself those 17 minutes. She decided at some point during them that this would be the total accounting for grief, that she would take precisely this much time, and then she would stand up and deal with the facts of her situation. The facts were these. She was in the Montana Territory at the edge of a valley called Frost Hollow, which she knew only by the name on Pratt's maps. She had the supplies that were hers, a portion of the preserved food she had packed, her mother's survival tools, including a good hunting knife and a hatchet wool blankets, a cast iron pot, a coil of rope, her own clothing, and the silver watch. Edmund had taken the wagon and the 2 oxen which were registered in his name. He had left her the mule perhaps from some residual guilt, or perhaps because the mule was aging and lame in the right foreleg and of limited value on a fast journey with a lighter woman. She also had her mother's voice in her head, which was not a tender voice. Her mother, Della Mae Crocker, had been a prairie woman of the old school, which meant she had survived things that would have broken the average spirit and had emerged from the surviving with a philosophy that was not precisely warm but was absolutely reliable. Della May had taught her daughter to set snares by the time she was 8, to what to read weather, to preserve meat, to find water, to fell a small tree, to build a fire in wet conditions, to navigate by stars. She had done this not out of particular affection, but out of the fundamental belief that a woman who could not survive alone would eventually be forced to depend on someone who did not deserve her survival. "You will always be too much for the small ones," her mother had told her once, without preamble, while they were stripping bark from a log. Clara had been perhaps 12 years old and had not yet understood what this meant, or whether it was meant to comfort her. She understood it now. She understood it with a fullness she could not have managed at 12, and she pressed the understanding down into herself like a foundation stone, and she stood up. She took what was hers from the wagon. She left what was not. She tied the mule to a pine at the wood's edge, speaking to him in a low, even voice, promising him she would manage the leg as best she could. Then she walked back to the wagon circle one final time. She had one conversation with young Nell Pratt, the captain's daughter, who was 17, and had been kind to Clara in the small, shy way of a girl who does not yet know how to be bold in her kindness. Nell pressed a packet of dried beans into her hands and said very quietly that she thought what Edmund had done was a wicked thing, and that she was sorry. Clara looked at the girl for a long moment. She thanked her. She pocketed the beans. She did not hug the girl, though some part of her wanted to, because she had decided that she could not afford the softening of it. She walked into the tree line as the wagon train was hitching up behind her. She did not look back. She had discovered standing at the fire, reading that note for the second time, that looking back was a luxury she no longer intended to indulge. The woods at the edge of Frost Hollow were old-growth Douglas fir and tamarack, the trees enormous and widely spaced, with a soft floor of needles that silenced her footsteps and filtered the September light into something slant and golden, and if she was being entirely honest with herself, beautiful. The mule walked quietly beside her, his lame leg causing him to pitch and correct with every third step, and she matched her pace to his without thinking about it. She had always been good at matching her pace to those who needed it. She found her spot before noon. A natural shelter formed by a granite outcropping on the north side and a stand of young fir on the east and south, with a good sightline to a small creek running 30 yards west. It was exactly what her mother would have chosen, and she stood in the center of it for a moment, with her hands at her sides, looking at the angles, calculating what she had and what she would need. She had perhaps 6 weeks before the first hard frost, if the season was typical. She did not know yet whether the season was typical. She had a hatchet, not an axe, which was one of her more pressing problems. She had rope and a hunting knife. She had her cast-iron pot and the dried beans Nell Pratt had given her, and her own portion of the preserved food, which was enough for perhaps 3 weeks if she was careful and supplemented it. She was careful. She supplemented it. The first week was the hardest in the ways she expected, and the easiest in the ways she did not. The physical labor of building shelter was not new to her. She had built and repaired frontier structures for the duration of her marriage, doing the work while Edmund supervised or theorized or was otherwise occupied with matters he considered more suited to his abilities. The work of it was familiar in her shoulders and her back, and her hands the specific fatigue of it, the way the muscles burned in the evening and were ready again by morning. That part she could manage. What she had not anticipated was the silence. Not the silence of the woods, which was full of sound, the creek and the birds and the wind in the high branches and the small industry of animals going about their lives around her. She had not anticipated the particular interior silence of being, for the first time in her adult life, entirely answerable to herself. There was no one to consult. There was no one whose mood she needed to read before she spoke. There was no one who might find fault with the placement of a wall, or the construction of a fire, or the proportion of seasoning in a pot of beans. There was no one watching. She had not known until that silence settled around her how much of her energy had always been consumed by the watching of others. The lean-to took shape over 4 days. She felled 3 small trees with her hatchet, which was slower and harder than an axe would have allowed, but possible with patience and the right angle of stroke. She lashed the cross pieces with rope and banked the back wall with packed earth and pine boughs. The roof was her main concern, and she spent the better part of an afternoon solving it, cutting fir boughs in graduated lengths and layering them the way her mother had shown her, overlapping like shingles, dense enough to shed water, if not to stop a hard driving rain. It was not a house. It was not even a cabin. It was a structure designed to buy time, and it served that purpose. She set snares along the creek and along 3 game trails she identified by track and scat and the subtle press of earth that told her where animals moved with confidence. She caught 2 rabbits in the first week, a larger hare in the second. She rendered the fat carefully and used it for the cooking and for her hands, which were beginning to crack in the cooling air. She gathered late-season berries and certain roots she could identify with confidence, leaving those she could not identify strictly alone. Her mother's voice on the subject of uncertain plants had been absolute and non-negotiable. She did not cry again after those 17 minutes at the wagon. She had promised herself the 17 minutes, and she kept the promise, and she did not revisit it. But Edmund's words surfaced sometimes unbidden in the quiet work of the day. She would be laying a snare with careful, practiced fingers, and suddenly his handwriting would be there. Behind her eyes, the particular slant of the letters, the deliberate way he had set down those words as if they were simply a statement of observable fact. Too big, too ugly, too heavy a burden. She had understood for a long time that her husband did not find her beautiful. She had understood it in the way that a person understands a thing that is never directly said but is communicated through 1,000 small omissions, through the quality of attention that is and is not given, through the difference between being looked at and being seen. She had understood it, and she had accommodated it the way she accommodated most difficult truths, by making herself useful enough that beauty became secondary, by making herself so competent and so reliable that no one needed to evaluate her on other grounds. She had believed that arrangement to be stable. She had believed that a woman who could build and preserve and repair and endure had secured some fundamental place in the world, a place that could not be revoked by the accident of her physical particulars. She had been wrong. She knew that now, with a clarity that was almost impersonal, almost clinical. She had been wrong about the stability of that arrangement, and she had paid for the error in front of 37 witnesses on a September morning in the Montana Territory. She did not know yet what the corrected understanding should look like. She only knew the first principle of it, which was this: she would not place herself in a position to be assessed and found wanting again. She would not give anyone that authority over the terms of her existence. She would build something here, in this tree line, in this valley, she had not chosen, but had been left in, and it would belong to her entirely. And no one's opinion of her size, or her face, or the roughness of her hands would have any bearing on its walls. This was not wisdom yet. She would recognize it later as the particular kind of pride that is mostly made of wound, a pride that is less a strength than a scar, serviceable and protective, but not quite the real thing. But in those first weeks at the edge of Frost Hollow, it was what she had, and she used it the way she used everything else that was available to her, practically, and without sentiment, and to the very last of its utility. She was 3 weeks into this self-constructed life on a clear morning with frost on the grass and the creek beginning to run slower when she first became aware of being watched. She had been splitting wood. The hatchet was inadequate for the task, requiring more strokes per log and producing less precise splits than a proper axe would allow, and she had adapted her technique to compensate, scoring the grain with the knife first and angling her strokes to follow the natural lines of the wood. It was slow work and not particularly efficient, but it was working, and she was absorbed in the mechanics of it, the placement of the log, the angle, the rotation of the wrist, the follow-through, when something in her peripheral vision caused her to pause. She straightened. She looked toward the tree line to the north, the direction of the high meadow, without making it obvious that she was looking. There was a man on horseback at the edge of the trees, perhaps 60 yards out. He was sitting very still. He had been there long enough that his horse had found a patch of late grass to investigate, which meant he had not arrived moments ago. He was simply observing her. Clara returned to her wood splitting. She was aware of a complex internal reaction that was not quite the alarm it perhaps should have been, living alone and being observed by an unknown man in the territorial wilderness, and not quite indifference either. She continued splitting wood with the same attention she had given it before, though she was now also tracking the sounds of the meadow, the horse's movement, the quality of stillness from that direction. He did not approach. After perhaps another 20 minutes, she heard the soft recession of hoofbeats moving back across the meadow. She saw him 3 more times over the following week, always at a distance, always still. Once on the ridge above the creek, once at the meadow's edge again, once briefly in the tree line to the east at dusk when she was banking her evening fire. He never came closer. He never called out. He watched with the patient, deliberate attention of a man who was evaluating something he had not yet decided about. She did not know who he was. She filed his existence under facts she was aware of but had not yet determined the significance of, and she continued her work. On the 22nd day of her solitude, the man rode directly to her clearing. He came in from the north at a walk, no attempt at quiet, but no particular announcement either, and he stopped his horse at the edge of her camp and looked at her for a moment before he dismounted. He was a tall man, lean in the way of men who work hard in all weather, with the kind of weathered face that gave little away about his precise age, though she placed him in his early 40s. He had a scar that ran from his left cheekbone to the corner of his jaw, old and well settled into the architecture of his face and eyes of a color that she could not immediately name, somewhere between gray and the particular blue of winter sky. His clothing was plain good quality and maintained with care. His horse was a strong, well-kept animal. Both man and horse had the look of self-sufficiency that Clara had learned to recognize, that particular combination of capability and quiet that belonged to people who had stopped waiting for assistance and built their competence around its absence. He removed his hat. He said his name was Thomas Hale. He said he had a ranch at the north end of the valley, 600 acres, a cabin, a barn, a herd of cattle, and 2 horses besides this one. He said he had been watching her work for 2 weeks and had come to make her a proposal. He said all of this without preamble and without the performative awkwardness of a man who had rehearsed. He spoke the way he apparently did everything efficiently and without decoration. The proposal was simple. Winter in Frost Hollow was not a season that could be survived in a lean-to, no matter how well constructed. He had, as stated, a cabin with a good stove and a full winter's worth of salted meat and root vegetables and dried corn. He needed, he said without apparent embarrassment, a capable partner for the season. Not a servant, he clarified carefully. A partner. Someone to manage the cabin and the household work, while he managed the herd and the structures, and to assist with the larger work when 2 sets of hands were needed, which in a Montana winter was often. He proposed a marriage of convenience. Legal and formal, he said, because legal and formal protected them both, which was a practical consideration he appeared to have thought through with some care. He said he had no interest in what he called a porcelain arrangement, by which she understood him to mean a wife who was purely decorative and structurally fragile. He said, with the directness of a man who has decided that clarity is more respectful than performance, that he had watched her work and she was exactly the kind of person this ranch required, and that he suspected she needed what the ranch could offer, and that this seemed like a basis for a reasonable partnership. Then he stopped talking and waited. Clara had listened to this speech with her hatchet in her hand and sawdust on her coat. She had listened to it carefully, not only to what was being said, but to the quality underneath it, to what the tone and the word choices and the silences between sentences communicated about the man delivering them. She had spent 11 years listening in that double register, tracking what was said and what was meant, learning to hear the distance between them. She heard in Thomas Hale's proposal no contempt. She heard no performance of reluctant charity. She heard no implication that he was doing her a favor that she should be grateful for and would be expected to acknowledge. She heard a man who had assessed a practical problem and proposed a practical solution with a frankness she found on reflection more respectful than the elaborate courtesies she had received from men who thought less of her. She also heard the word burden nowhere in his proposal. And yet, she said no. She said it quietly and without anger, because she did not feel anger toward this man, and she tried to be precise about her reasons without giving more of herself than the situation required. She told him that she was building something here, that the fact of having built it mattered to her in a way she did not think she could fully explain, that the specific freedom of owing no one and answering to no one was something she had come to in a hard way and was not ready to relinquish. She told him that she appreciated his plainness and that she did not doubt his word, but that what she could not afford at this particular moment in her life was to become again a woman defined by her usefulness to someone else's enterprise. She watched something move through his expression when she said that something careful and attending, the look of a man hearing a thing he had not expected and was genuinely taking in rather than waiting to respond to. He nodded. He replaced his hat. He said he understood, and she believed that he did, or at least that he was making a genuine effort, to which was more than she had generally experienced, and which she noted without quite knowing what to do with it. He reached into his saddlebag. He brought out an axe, a full-sized felling axe, with a hickory handle, and a head that was obviously quality, well-balanced, and recently sharpened. He set it against the nearest tree. He said nothing about it. He mounted his horse and rode back north across the meadow without looking back. She stood for a long moment looking at the axe. Then she picked it up and felt the weight of it, the right weight, the weight a tool should be, and she held it for a moment longer before she set it against her woodpile and went back to work. She thought about him on and off over the next 2 weeks. She thought about him the way you think about something you have not resolved, returning to it without intending to, the way the mind worries at an unfinished thing. She thought about the word partner and the way he had used it, the careful way he had delineated what he meant by it. She thought about the axe, which was an act of respect so precisely calibrated to what she actually needed that it struck her as, in its own quiet way, the most articulate thing anyone had said to her in months. She did not change her mind, but she thought about it. The cold came harder at the beginning of October, and then on the 11th of October, which she knew from her mother's watch, even if she could not have said what day of the week it was, the real cold arrived. It arrived overnight while she slept, and she woke to a temperature so far below what she had been enduring that for a moment she could not process the difference. The air in the lean-to had a substance to it, a weight and a bite, that was categorically different from the cold she had been managing. She went outside and read the sky, and understood what she was looking at. This was not a cold snap. This was the beginning. She worked through the morning and the afternoon with a controlled urgency that did not tip into panic, because panic was a luxury she had decided against. She reinforced the lean-to walls. She brought in as much wood as she could stack. She checked her food supplies with a precision she had been avoiding, some part of her reluctant to confront the arithmetic of survival with full clarity, and confronted them now. The snares were frozen. The creek was beginning to form a skin of ice at the edges. The meat she had preserved would last, if she was very careful, another 3 weeks at a minimum survival ration. The cold, if it continued at this intensity, would find the gaps in her shelter within days. She sat inside the lean-to with her cast-iron pot and her mother's silver watch, and the full, quiet, unflinching assessment of her situation, and she arrived at a conclusion that her pride did not care for, but that her intelligence presented as non-negotiable. She was looking at the arithmetic of dying alone in the Montana Territory in order to avoid the appearance of needing help. And that, when stated that plainly, was not a decision that a woman of sound mind could make. She sat with it for a while. She gave it the consideration it deserved, which was significant, because what she was about to do felt like a revision of the self she had been constructing for the past 37 days, and revisions of the self are not undertaken lightly when the self in question has been doing the constructing under difficult conditions. Then she stood up, packed what was essential into her pack, spoke to the lame mule in a low voice that told him they were going, and walked north. She did not walk north as a woman who had given up. She had thought carefully about the distinction in the hour between her decision and her departure, because the distinction mattered to her absolutely. She was not going to Thomas Hale's ranch because she could not survive alone. She was going because she could not survive alone this winter, in this structure, with these supplies and at these temperatures, and because surviving was the prerequisite for everything else she intended. The pride that had kept her in that lean-to was a real thing, and it was hers, but she was not willing to die for a performance of it. She arrived at the ranch as the last light was leaving the sky. The cabin sat solid and dark against the tree line, with smoke rising from the chimney, and light behind the oiled paper windows, and the barn beyond it with the warm sounds of cattle in the cold air. She had never seen anything that struck her as more specifically beautiful than the smoke rising from that chimney in the last of the October daylight. She tied the mule. She walked to the door. She knocked. Thomas Hale opened it after a moment. He looked at her. He looked at the pack on her back, and the mule at the post, and the careful, undefeated expression on her face, and he said nothing for a moment that contained considerable amount of understanding. She told him she had come to discuss terms. He opened the door wider and stepped back to let her in. She entered his cabin, and she did not look at it the way a woman looks at a rescue. She looked at it the way a contractor looks at a job site, with a professional eye and a clear accounting of what was here and what could be done with it. She stood in the center of the room with her pack and her dignity and her 37 days of hard-purchased self-knowledge, and she told Thomas Hale, in plain and specific language, what she was prepared to contribute and what she required in return. She required, she said, her own sleeping area. She required to be consulted on decisions that affected the household. She required that what she built here and what she learned here and what she did here be considered hers in equal measure, not by the grace of his good will, but by the terms of their arrangement. She required that the work she did be evaluated by its quality, and not by the novelty of a woman having done it. She did not use the word equal. She used the word fair, which she thought was more precise. Equal implied sameness. Fair implied justice, and justice was what she was actually after. Thomas Hale listened to all of this. He leaned against the wall beside his stove with his arms crossed and his expression attentive, not challenging and not performing patience, but genuinely attending to what she was saying in the way that she had noticed him attend to things, with the quality of a man for whom listening was not a gap between his own statements, but an act in itself. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair." Just the one word. Just the assessment and the agreement offered without negotiation and without the inflation of making a virtue of his own reasonableness. She held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm, and his hand was rough, and he shook her hand the way you shake the hand of someone whose word you have decided to take seriously. Then he showed her where to put her pack, and he handed her a bowl of the venison stew that had been sitting on the back of the stove, and he sat down at the table and went back to the harness he had been mending, and she sat across from him and ate the best thing she had tasted in 37 days without saying anything about it. Outside, the temperature was still falling. Inside, the stove burned steady, and the soup was hot, and the mule was in the barn with the cattle. His bad leg cleaned and wrapped with a competence that she would learn in the morning was entirely characteristic. She had not been rescued. She had negotiated a partnership. The difference she had decided on the walk north under the cold Montana stars was everything. She slept that first night on a narrow cot behind the curtain Tom had rigged from a length of canvas partitioning the single room into 2 functional spaces with the same practical economy he appeared to apply to everything. The cot was firm and the blanket was heavy wool, and the stove held its heat through the night in the way that only a well-built cabin with properly chinked walls can manage. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind working itself up outside, and the particular creak and settle of a structure that had been built to last, and she felt something she did not immediately have a name for. It was not comfort exactly, because comfort implied a softening, and she was not soft, not yet, perhaps not ever. It was something closer to the sensation of a knot that has been bearing weight for so long that the release of tension is almost painful in its suddenness. She did not call it relief. She called it information. She filed it and went to sleep. The first morning established the rhythm that would define the weeks to come. She was up before the light, which she gathered was also Tom's practice, and they navigated the small space of the cabin with the careful, slightly formal courtesy of 2 people who have agreed to a contract and are both determined to honor its terms. He did not tell her what needed doing. She looked at the cabin, and the morning, and the stove, and the stores, and she determined what needed doing, and she did it because this was what she had agreed to, and because she was constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise. She found his kitchen in good order, which told her something about him. A man who keeps his kitchen organized is a man who takes the work of daily survival seriously and does not consider it beneath him. The supplies were intelligently stored: root vegetables in the cool corner, dried goods in sealed tins, salt and flour, and the rendered fat from his fall butchering, all accounted for and rationed with care. He had been managing alone, and he had been managing well, and she respected that without feeling the need to say so. She made breakfast from what was available: cornmeal mush with a piece of cured pork and the last of some dried apples she found in a tin at the back of the shelf. She put his portion on the table when she heard him coming in from the barn, and she was at the stove with her own when he came through the door bringing cold air and the smell of cattle with him. He sat down, ate without comment, and then said that the cornmeal was better than his, which she understood from a man of his particular economy with words was a significant statement. The days built themselves one on top of the other with the steady, unglamorous logic of survival work. Clara mended gear and managed the household stores, and cooked and maintained the stove, and patched a section of the cabin wall where the chinking had crumbled, using a mixture she made from clay and dry grass that her mother had taught her and that set hard in the cold. She reorganized his storage to improve the flow between the root cellar access and the main cooking area, reducing the number of trips required in the worst weather. She took inventory of everything twice and kept a running tally in the notebook he had given her without being asked, a small gesture of practical foresight that she noted and added to her accounting of him. She also worked outside when the work required it, and it often did. She assisted with the cattle when the herd needed moving or when an animal needed attending, and she discovered that she had a facility with livestock that she had not previously had opportunity to fully develop a steadiness of presence and a reading of animal behavior that Tom acknowledged with a nod the first time he witnessed it and did not make a production of afterward, which was exactly the right response. She helped reinforce the barn walls against the drafts that were finding their way through the older boards on the north side, and she dug out and improved the drainage channel behind the cabin that was threatening to ice over in a way that would have sent meltwater under the floor come spring. She worked as hard as she had ever worked in her life, which was saying something, and she worked with the specific focused quality that comes from working for yourself or for something that is yours even partially, even contractually. There was a difference she could feel in her body between labor that belongs to you and labor that is extracted from you, and she felt it now in the way her fatigue at the end of each day was clean and complete, rather than ground down and diminished. Tom worked at the same pace and with the same quality. She watched him in the first weeks with the careful analytical attention she had trained herself to apply to people looking for the places where his stated intentions and his actual behavior diverged. Because in her experience that divergence was always there, and the only question was how wide it ran. She watched for the moment when the contract of equal footing would reveal itself as a performance, when his patience with her competence would curdle into the subtle management of a capable woman who needed to be kept from exceeding her designated space. She watched, and she did not find it. What she found instead was a man who operated by a code so simple and so consistently applied that it took her some time to recognize it as a code at all, because she had been accustomed to codes that were stated elaborately and followed selectively. Tom's code appeared to be this: a thing that needed doing should be done well, and the person who did it well deserved to have it acknowledged, and the manner of the acknowledgment should fit the gravity of the thing, no more and no less. He applied this to his own work, and he applied it to hers, and he did not appear to apply it differently based on which of them had done the work. It was a disorienting experience being evaluated by a standard that did not shift. There were silences between them that she gradually learned to read as different things. There was the silence of two people working in parallel, which was a companionable thing, full of its own unspoken communication. There was the silence of a man who was tired at the end of a long day and had no energy for the performance of sociability, which she found she did not mind because she felt the same. There was occasionally rarer and more charged the silence of something being considered but not yet said, and she learned to recognize that one by a particular quality in his stillness, the way a man holds himself when he is attending to an interior process. He did not ask her questions about Edmund. She did not offer. The past was a country neither of them appeared to have any particular need to revisit in the evenings, which suited her absolutely. What he did ask one evening in the second week of November, while she was patching the elbow of his heavy work coat, and he was at the table with the ranch ledger, was what she had done before the wagon train. Not who she had been married to, or where she had come from, or why she had been in the party. Just what she had done, what work, what skills. She told him. She listed it plainly, the way she would have listed it for an employer, because she was not yet accustomed to being asked about her capabilities in a way that was not also a means of circumscribing them. She told him about her mother's teaching the survival knowledge and the livestock management and the building and the preserving. She told him about 11 years of frontier homesteading on the Nebraska plains, the specific kind of education that environment provides. She told him that she had always been the one to do the structural work and the outdoor work, in addition to the household work, and that she had, therefore, a broader range of practical experience than most women of her age and circumstance. He listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he said, "That explains the drainage channel." She looked at him. Something shifted in his expression very slightly, a quality that was not quite a smile, but was the country adjacent to one. She found somewhat to her own surprise that she wanted to know what his actual smile looked like, because she suspected it would be worth the wait. She went back to the coat sleeve without saying anything, but she sat with that small warmth for the rest of the evening, and it was some time before she identified it as the specific sensation of having been, for the first time in a very long while, genuinely recognized. November deepened and hardened. The temperature outside was becoming a serious and constant fact of their lives, something to be managed and respected the way you manage and respect a large, powerful, indifferent animal. The cattle required more attention as the cold drove them to crowd the barn, and there were days when Clara and Tom were both out in weather that had no interest in their continued survival, moving and feeding and checking the herd, coming in at the end of those days with ice on their clothing and a weariness so deep it sat in the bones. On one such evening in the middle of the month, Clara came in from checking the fence line on the east pasture and found the leak above her stove repaired. She stood looking at the repaired section of roof for a long moment. It was work she had been meaning to do herself, and had not yet found the right window of time for, and she had noted it on her internal list of things requiring attention without mentioning it to Tom, because it was her stove, and therefore her problem to address. He had done it while she was at the fence line. He had climbed up in the cold, sealed the gap in the shingles, come back down, and said nothing about it. She thought about going to find him in the barn and acknowledging it. She decided against it because she sensed from everything she had observed of him that he had not done it in order to be acknowledged, and that acknowledgment might actually embarrass him by making a statement of something he considered unremarkable. She let it stand as what it was, an act complete in itself, requiring no commentary. The following week she noticed that the firewood was not only refilled, but reorganized, stacked at precisely the height and proximity that she had determined was optimal for her reach, an adjustment from the way he had always stacked it, which was taller and set further back. He had watched her. He had noted the adjustment she made each time she worked from the stack, the specific geometry of what was convenient for her particular height and reach, and he had reconfigured the stack to match it. She was standing at the stove with her back to the room when she understood what he had done, and she stood there for a moment with her hand on the pot handle, very still, feeling something she recognized from a great distance, something she had not let herself feel in a very long time, because she had walled off the section of herself that was capable of it with the same practical industry she applied to building any necessary structure. She was moved. She did not let it show, because she did not yet know what to do with it, and a feeling you do not know what to do with is not ready to be shown. But she was moved, and she noted it, and she filed it carefully in the growing account she was keeping of Thomas Hale. December arrived, and with it the particular tyranny of the shortest days, the gray light lasting only a handful of hours. Before the dark returned, the stove burning continuously, the cabin's small warmth, its own kind of world. She and Tom had fallen into an ease with each other that she was careful not to examine too directly, the way you avoid staring at a wild thing that has come close, because examination can startle what careful patience has drawn near. They talked more easily now. Not fluently, they were both people who had learned that words are expensive and should be spent wisely, but with increasing comfort and the occasional dry precision that she found she liked in him. He was not a humorless man, she had discovered. He was a man whose humor was quiet and required attention to catch a quality she found she preferred to the loud, self-announcing variety. One evening she told him about her mother's instruction on the drainage channel design, the specific way Della May had explained the relationship between slope and velocity, and where ice forms under different temperature gradients. And she watched his expression shift into something she had not seen there before, something that was straightforwardly interested, the look of a man learning something he wanted to know. He asked her 2 precise questions. She answered them. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that the drainage issue on the north side of the barn had been a problem for 3 winters, and he now understood why. She said, without thinking, "I can fix it in the spring." He said, I know you can." She looked at him. He was looking at the ledger again. She returned to what she had been doing, but those 4 words sat in her chest the rest of the evening, specific and warm, the way a coal holds heat, and she could not have fully explained what they meant to her, except that they were said simply and without hesitation, and without any of the qualifications with which she had learned to expect competence attributed to her to be surrounded. The hands were the problem she had not anticipated. She had worked with her hands her entire life, and she knew their condition, which was rough and calloused and generally impervious to the normal inconveniences of cold. But the Montana winter at this altitude was not a normal inconvenience, and by December her hands were cracking at the knuckles and at the base of the fingers where the rope work was concentrated, splitting open sometimes to bleed in thin lines that were a real impediment to the finer work of mending and cooking and the precise tasks that required full dexterity. She treated them as best she could with the rendered fat and kept working because there was no alternative to keeping working. She did not mention it to Tom. There was nothing to mention. It was a physical fact to be managed, not a complaint to be made. On a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of December, she came in from the barn to find a package on the table in front of her place. It was wrapped in a piece of clean cloth and tied with a length of the rawhide he used for binding harness. Her name was not on it, but it was placed precisely where she sat, which made its destination unmistakable. She sat down and untied the rawhide. Inside the cloth was a pair of gloves. They were work gloves, heavy leather, the kind of substantial and functional gear that working hands require, not the delicate gloves made for soft-skinned women who do not work. They were made from a very good piece of hide, tanned and softened well, with a wide cuff that would stay tucked inside a coat sleeve. And they were sized, she understood immediately when she held them up, sized for her hands, not the standard size that would have been too narrow in the palm and tight across the knuckles, but sized precisely for her particular broad, capable hands, the hands that Edmund had once said looked like a farrier's. She turned them over. The stitching was his. She had learned his stitching from the harness work, the particular tension he used, the way his wax thread lay flat and even. He had cut the pattern himself, she realized, because no standard pattern would have produced this fit. And he had stitched them himself with the care of someone attending to a task that mattered to them, and he had said nothing about it and put them on the table, and gone out to the barn before she was up. She put them on. They fit the way a thing fits when it was made by someone who had paid specific, respectful attention to its intended recipient, fitting not just in the technical dimensions, but in the feeling of it, the sensation of being accurately seen and responded to. She sat at the table in Tom Hale's cabin in the deep Montana winter, with her large, rough, cracked hands inside perfectly made leather gloves, and she felt the walls of the structure she had built around herself shift, not fall. She was not in the business of walls falling, but shift the way a structure settles when it finds more solid ground than it was originally set on a small but fundamental reorientation. She stayed at the table for a while. Then she went to the barn door, and she said without opening it loudly enough to carry over the wind, "They fit." There was a pause. Then from inside the barn, his voice low and even, carrying no performance of casualness or expectation, simply carrying itself, "Good." She went back inside. She stood at her stove, and she made breakfast, and she wore the gloves, and she was aware with the cautious clarity of a woman who has been wrong before and does not intend to be careless about this, that something in her had changed. She could not yet name the change with the precision she preferred. She could only observe its effects the way you observe the effects of a shift in temperature, not by seeing the temperature itself, but by watching what it does to water, to breath, to the quality of the light. She was no longer working to prove something. She had not noticed the moment when that shifted, but it had, and what she was doing now was simply working for the life they were building in this cabin through the teeth of this winter, working for something that was hers in a way that had nothing to do with the contractual terms they had negotiated at the door 7 weeks ago. She did not call it love. She was not ready to call it anything, and she was wary of names given too early to things that deserve to be understood before they are labeled. But she looked up from her stove when Tom came in from the barn that morning. Snow on his shoulders and cold in the room with him. And she held his gaze for a moment before she looked back at the pan. And in that moment she was not calculating anything at all. He sat down at the table. He said the east fence was holding, but the middle post needed attention in the spring. She said she had seen the lean when she was out yesterday and had already noted it. He said he figured she had. Outside, the wind moved across the valley of Frost Hollow with all the impersonal authority of a Montana December, and inside the cabin the stove burned, and the coffee was hot, and there were 2 people at opposite ends of a small wooden table who were without ceremony and without rushing, it becoming something neither of them had quite planned on, and both of them, if pressed, would have acknowledged they were grateful for. She flexed her hands inside the gloves. The leather was warm and exact. She thought about what it meant that a man would cut a pattern by hand from observation alone to fit hands that the world had consistently told her were too large and too rough and too blunt for tenderness to bother with. She thought about what that said about what he saw when he looked at her, and she thought about whether it was possible that what he saw was simply accurate, simply the truth of her, and that the fault had always been with the looking and not with the thing being looked at. She was not there yet. She was close to there, standing at its edge, and the edge was enough for now. The edge was more than she had believed herself capable of reaching again 37 days ago when she had stood at a wagon wheel in the September morning and read a note in her husband's handwriting and swallowed her shame like broken glass. She was Clara Hale, now in the legal sense. She was beginning slowly and without fanfare to consider what it might mean to become Clara Hale. In the deeper sense, the sense that had to do with what you believe yourself to be worth and what you allow yourself to want, and whether those 2 things might in the right circumstances be permitted to expand. The winter was not over. The hardest part of it, though, none of them knew it yet, had not yet arrived. But in the cabin at the north end of Frost Hollow, by the light of a good stove with leather gloves on her large and capable hands, Clara allowed herself for the first time since September to consider the future without flinching. The gloves changed something in the daily texture of her life that she had not fully anticipated. It was not simply that her hands healed, though they did, the cracks closing over the following week as the leather kept out the worst of the cold, and the wind, the bleeding stopping the skin returning to its normal tough and serviceable condition. It was that every time she pulled them on in the morning, every time she felt the precise fit of them settle around her fingers and across her palm, she was reminded of the fact of being seen. Not evaluated, not assessed for adequacy. Simply seen with accuracy and without judgment, the way you see something you have been paying genuine attention to. She did not speak of this to Tom. It was not the kind of thing either of them spoke of directly. Their communication had developed its own dialect by now, part spoken and part action and part the particular quality of silence that exists between 2 people who have stopped performing for each other and begun simply inhabiting the same space with honesty. She had come to understand that this dialect was not a lesser form of communication, but a different and in some ways more reliable one, because it could not be constructed the way language can be constructed, could not be assembled from borrowed sentiment or strategic performance. It was the dialect of what people actually do, stripped of what they say they will do or mean to do or wished they had done. Tom's dialect was consistent, which was the thing about it that continued to surprise her. She kept waiting for the inconsistency, the place where the behavior failed to match the code, because 11 years of a different education had taught her to look for it and to find it. She looked and she did not find it, and the looking itself gradually began to cost her something, the energy of constant vigilance applied to a situation that did not warrant it, and she began slowly, and without announcing it to herself, to look less. Christmas came and went with a quietness that suited them both. She had not asked him about the holiday, and he had not raised it, but she woke that morning to find he had added a small measure of dried fruit to the breakfast porridge. A departure from practicality in the direction of occasion that she found she appreciated precisely because it was small and unannounced, and expected no particular response from her. She added an extra measure of sugar to the coffee without comment. He drank it without comment. This was how they celebrated in the quiet language they had made together, and she found it on reflection more genuinely festive than any elaborate observance she could remember. She had given him a thing, she had made a practical thing, a set of additional harness ties she had cut and braided from the spare leather in his tack room, using a plaiting technique her mother had taught her that produced a stronger and more even result than the standard braid. She left them on the barn door. He found them when he went out for the morning chores, and when he came back in, he held them up briefly without speaking, and then set them on the hook beside the door where he kept his most used gear, which was, she had learned, where Tom Hale put things he valued. January arrived and hardened everything in the ground and the air and the light, which was thin and pale and lasted barely long enough each day to accomplish the outdoor work before the dark returned. It was during January that Clara began, in small and unplanned increments, to let herself look at Tom Hale in a way she had previously kept strictly functional. She had been cataloging him from the beginning, the way she cataloged everything practically and analytically, filing observations under the heading of information relevant to their working relationship. She knew the quality of his work and the shape of his code and the specific economy of his language. She knew that he was careful with tools and patient with animals, and that he had a way of approaching a difficult physical task that involved a period of still observation before action, which she had come to think of as his method. The habit of a man who has learned that understanding precedes effort, and that effort without understanding is waste. What she had not been cataloging deliberately, and with some effort, was the rest of it. She noticed it first one morning in early January, when they were working together in the barn on a section of the roof that had taken damage in a windstorm, Clara on one side of the beam and Tom on the other, both of them working by the gray light coming through the gap they were repairing. The work required coordination, the kind of close, unspoken physical coordination that develops between people who have been working together long enough to anticipate each other, and she was aware in the midst of it of the specific warmth of him on the other side of the beam, the sound of his breathing, the way his hands moved on the wood with such deliberate and practiced certainty. She returned to her side of the beam and she worked, and she did not examine the observation too closely, but she filed it in a different part of the ledger than she had been using the part she had considered closed. The thaw, when it came, would still be months away. But something was thawing in the cabin at the north end of Frost Hollow, slowly and by degrees, in the manner of things that have been frozen very thoroughly and need to be treated gently in the unfreezing. The cattle were her education that January. She had known livestock in the general way of frontier women who have lived around animals their whole lives, but Tom's herd was a specific and ongoing lesson in the more particular knowledge that comes from being responsible for the survival of animals in serious cold. She learned the individual animals by name and by temperament, learned which ones were prone to crowding in weather and which ones needed to be separated. When they were unwell, learned the specific signs that distinguished ordinary winter sluggishness from the beginning of something that required intervention. Tom showed her without making a lesson of it, which was his method, demonstrating through doing and trusting her to observe and incorporate. He did not explain unless she asked, and she asked with increasing frequency as her confidence in his patience for genuine questions solidified. He answered with the same precision he brought to everything, no more detail than was useful and no less, which meant she always came away with exactly what she needed and a clear sense of where to go next. She was checking the youngest of the cattle one afternoon, a heifer that had been off her feed for 2 days, when she identified the problem, a piece of packed ice lodged in the animal's hoof that was causing significant discomfort. She removed it with her knife, and with the particular combination of gentleness and firmness that the job required, keeping her voice low and her movements steady until the animal quieted and she looked up to find Tom in the barn doorway watching. She said, "Ice in the hoof. She should be eating by tomorrow." He said, "I didn't find that." She said, "You didn't have the angle I had." She pulled off her left glove and checked the hoof again with her bare hand, feeling for anything remaining. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've got a better feel for them than I do." She replaced her glove and stood up. She looked at him. He was entirely serious, and he was entirely comfortable saying it. A man acknowledging a competence without any of the awkwardness that men so often brought to the acknowledgement of a woman's superior skill in a domain they considered their own. There was no performance of graciousness in it. He was simply stating what he had observed. She said, "I don't know about better. Different, maybe." He considered this. "Different that works is better," he said, and went back to what he had been doing. She thought about that for most of the rest of the afternoon. She thought about the straightforward logic of it, and about what it felt like to have a strength recognized not as an exception or an anomaly or a pleasant surprise, but simply as a fact, a useful fact, a good one. February brought a brief warming several days in the middle of the month, when the temperature rose enough to make the outdoor work less punishing, and in this relative gentleness, Clara and Tom began the work of planning for spring. They sat at the table in the evenings with his maps and her notebook, and they talked through what needed doing and in what order and what materials they would need. And this planning was its own form of intimacy. She thought the intimacy of two people taking a future seriously enough to prepare for it in detail. The barn drainage project she had promised in December was on the list. And when Tom spread the map of the property and she leaned over it and pointed to the grade lines and explained what she wanted to do with the runoff, he followed her, reasoning without difficulty, and added 2 observations from his knowledge of the ground on the north side that she incorporated into the plan without friction. They were good at this, she had discovered. They were good at the collaborative thinking that required each person to bring their specific knowledge fully and neither to defer nor to dominate. She said one evening over the map, "My mother would have liked you." She had not planned to say it. It arrived complete from some honest interior place that had been operating without her full oversight. He looked up from the map. The expression on his face was one she had seen there before, but not often, something open and unguarded, the look of a man who has been offered something real and is taking a moment to receive it properly. He said, "Tell me about her." So she did. She told him about Delamay Crocker, about the woman who had taught her to read weather and set snares and build a fire in wet conditions, who had not been demonstratively affectionate, but whose love had been entirely present in the form of every skill she transmitted, every hard lesson she insisted on, every preparation she made for a daughter she knew would need to be capable of surviving in a world that did not extend much patience to women who could not manage on their own. She told him about the way her mother had looked at her large, broad-shouldered child and seen not a problem to be solved, but a particular kind of person to be properly equipped. Tom listened in the way he listened, with his full and quiet attention. When she had finished, he said, "She was right about you." Clara looked at the map. She said, "She was right about most things." "Not most," he said. "You." The word landed in the small space of the cabin, and she did not look up from the map. But she felt it settle somewhere deep in her chest, in the region she had kept walled and careful and specifically uninhabited for the past several months. And she felt the walls there shift again further, this time a more fundamental reorientation of the structure. She changed the subject to the east fence post. He let her, and they moved back to the practical ground they both navigated most easily. But the thing he had said remained in the cabin with them for the rest of the evening present, and Warm, an additional occupant of the room. March arrived in the manner that March arrives in that country, which is to say with the temperature still ferocious, but with a quality to the light that had changed, a lengthening and brightening that told you on some level below conscious analysis that the season was beginning its slow and hard-fought turn. Clara noticed it one morning when she was at the window with her coffee, and the early light was different, genuinely different from the light of January, carrying some quality of promise that winter light absolutely lacks. She stood at that window for longer than was strictly efficient and watched the light on the snow. Tom came in from the barn and found her there. He stopped beside her without ceremony and looked out the window at what she was looking at. They stood in silence for a moment, the two of them looking at the morning light on the snow-covered meadow that would be green in 2 months. He said, "You're staying." It was not precisely a question, but it was not a statement either. It was something in between, a space he had opened for her to step into or step back from as she chose. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the meadow, his profile against the morning light, the scar on his jaw, a pale line in it, his expression carrying that quality she had come to know as his particular form of openness. The openness of a man who does not often show what is underneath, but is showing it now, and has made that choice deliberately. She said, "I'm staying." He turned to look at her then, and what passed between them in that moment was not what she had expected, the decisive moments of her life to feel like nothing dramatic and nothing sudden, just two people looking at each other in the morning light of a cabin they had both kept alive through a Montana winter, and both knowing with a clarity that needed no decoration that they had built something real here. He reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the windowsill. His hand was large and rough and warm, and he held hers with the same quality of attention he brought to everything he considered worth his care. She turned her hand and let her fingers close around his, her broad, capable, newly healed fingers inside the permanent roughness of her own calloused skin, and she did not flinch from the contact or manage it or hold any part of herself in reserve. They stood at the window and held hands like two ordinary people, watching the morning which they were, except that ordinary obscures a great deal, because there is nothing ordinary about two people who have found each other at the far end of a hard passage and had the courage to stop there and build. She had come to this ranch as a negotiator with her terms and her pride and her freshly mortared walls. She had maintained those terms, and she did not regret them. They had been exactly right for who she was at the time and what she had needed to preserve. But she was not the same woman who had knocked on this door in October, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. She was not a woman who had been softened or diminished or talked out of herself. She was a woman who had been seen over and over with consistency and with care until the being seen had become a solid enough ground to stand on that she no longer needed the walls to hold herself upright. She thought of Della Mae, who had equipped her for survival, and who would have recognized she believed the nature of what she had found here. Her mother had not been a woman who idealized partnership. She had been a woman who understood its specific and practical value, the way two capable people working together can survive and build what one alone cannot, and the way that survival and building done with the right person could become something more than its component parts. She squeezed Tom's hand. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. Outside, the light continued to do what it was doing, which was the important work of beginning the long process of bringing the world back from the winter it had been through, and inside the cabin, two people stood at a window and felt the particular and uncomplicated peace of knowing where they were and choosing to remain there. The mule had recovered well over the winter. Tom had tended the leg through the cold months with the same careful and unglamorous attention he gave to everything cleaning and wrapping and adjusting the animal's work accordingly, and by March the limp was significantly reduced, and the animal moved with a confidence he had not had in the fall. Clara had watched this tending without commenting on it, but she had watched it carefully, because how a person treats an animal that is of limited usefulness tells you something about them that is not available in any other way. What it told her about Tom was consistent with everything else. She began in the slow brightening of March to be something she had almost forgotten she was capable of being. She began to be content. Not happy in the easy, unearned way that does not cost anything, and therefore does not mean very much, but content in the way that is built from accumulated evidence, from the slow, reliable accumulation of days in which you have been treated with honesty, and your work has been treated with respect, and the person you share your life with has been consistently what they appeared to be. That kind of content is a different and more durable thing she had discovered, and she held it carefully, knowing what it had cost, and therefore knowing its value. She also held it with a specific alertness, because she was Clara May, and Clara May did not hold anything without some watchful part of herself remaining aware. But the watchfulness was quieter now, less a sentry and more a habit. The way a person who has learned to read weather keeps a corner of their awareness on the sky, even on a clear day, not from anxiety, but from simple, well-trained attention. One evening she caught him looking at her across the table, with an expression she had not seen precisely before, something unguarded and warm and entirely direct. She held his gaze and did not look away, which was itself a thing she could not have done in October, not because she lacked courage, but because courage is not always the issue. Sometimes the issue is simply whether you believe you are worth being looked at that way. She was beginning slowly and with appropriate caution and with the full knowledge of what it had taken to get here to believe that she might be. She looked at him steadily across the table, in the lamplight, and she thought about the woman who had stood at a wagon wheel in September, reading a note in handwriting she had once believed she knew, and she thought about the 37 days in the lean-to, and the walk north in the October dark, and the knock on this door, and everything since. She thought about all of it with the clear, unflinching accounting she applied to all significant things, and what the accounting showed her was a woman who had survived and built and worked, and in spite of every reason not to allow herself to be opened again. That woman deserved to be looked at the way Tom Hale was looking at her now. She had earned it, not by being beautiful, in the way that requires no earning, but by being real, which is the harder and more durable kind. She let herself be looked at. She held his gaze across the lamplight, and she was in that moment entirely present, entirely herself, entirely without apology for the size and the strength and the roughness and the history of her. And it felt like standing up straight, for the first time after a very long time of making herself smaller than she was, and the straightening felt like the most natural thing in the world. Outside, a March wind moved across the valley with something different in it now, something that was no longer purely winter, and in the cabin the lamp burned steady, and the stove held its warmth, and two people sat at a table in the particular silence that means everything is being said. The March wind that had carried something different in it proved to be a false promise, as March winds in Montana often are. The brief softening lasted 9 days, long enough to make the world look tentatively hopeful, long enough for Clara to begin the drainage work on the north side of the barn with the ground thawed to a workable depth, long enough for the cattle to move with something approaching ease in the pasture. Then on the 10th day, the sky changed. Clara read it before Tom did, which surprised her and did not surprise her. She had been reading weather her whole life, taught by a woman who had learned that the sky in this country tells you everything you need to know if you have the patience to learn its language. She was at the barn door in the early morning looking north, and what she saw in the quality of the cloud formation on the horizon and the particular way the wind had dropped to almost nothing in the past hour told her something that her body registered before her mind had finished processing it. A stillness before a storm is not the same as an ordinary stillness. It has a held breath quality, a pressure to it that the body knows in the bones. She went inside and she looked at the barometric indicator Tom kept on the wall near the door, a simple instrument but a reliable one, and what it showed her confirmed what the sky had told her. She stood looking at it for a moment, doing the arithmetic of what they had and what they would need and how much time they likely had to prepare. Tom came in from checking the east fence and found her standing at the instrument with an expression he had learned to read as serious assessment rather than worry the particular stillness of Clara working a problem. He looked at the indicator. He looked at her. He said, "How long?" She said, 12 hours, maybe less. He accepted this without questioning her reading of it, which she noted filing it in the account she kept of him, the account that had grown very full over these months. He simply moved directly to the question of what needed doing and in what order, and they stood at the table for 20 minutes with his map and her notebook and worked through it together with the focused efficiency of two people who have learned to think alongside each other without friction. The cattle were the primary concern. Tom's herd of 32 animals needed to be brought in from the pasture and secured in the barn before the storm hit, along with sufficient feed for what could be several days of confinement. The barn itself needed its weakest points reinforced, particularly the north-facing wall section they had identified in their spring planning as a structural priority. The cabin needed its own preparation: storm shutters, checked firewood supply, maximized water stored inside in every available vessel against the possibility of the outdoor supply freezing over completely. They worked from that morning through to the last of the afternoon light without stopping except to eat, and they worked with a seamlessness that was its own kind of testimony to what they had built between them over the winter. Clara took the cattle while Tom worked on the barn wall because her facility with the herd was by now established and unquestioned, and she moved the animals with a quiet authority that kept the process orderly and calm, even as the atmospheric pressure continued its steady, ominous descent, and the animals felt it in the way animals feel these things with a nervous energy that wanted to scatter. She spoke to them as she worked low and even and continuous, not words exactly, but the vocal quality that communicates steadiness to a creature that cannot understand language, but understands tone absolutely. She moved them from the far pasture to the near, from the near to the barn lot, and finally into the barn itself, counting as each animal entered, reaching 32 as the first real wind arrived from the northwest, with a cold in it that was categorically different from the cold of the past weeks, a cold with intention to it. Tom was nailing the last brace on the north wall when she came in. She told him the count. He said he had 12 days of feed stored in the barn, which would be enough for any storm, but the absolute worst. She told him they should add the additional supply from the secondary storage regardless because she wanted the margin. He said she was right, and they moved the additional feed together in the last of the usable light. They were inside the cabin with the storm shutters secured and the water stored and the firewood stacked ceiling high against the interior wall when the storm arrived in earnest. It arrived the way the serious storms arrive in that country, not gradually but all at once, as if a door had been opened onto something enormous and indifferent. The wind went from present to ferocious in the span of minutes. The temperature outside, already severe, dropped to a depth that turned the very air into a weapon. Clara stood at the shuttered window and listened to the sound of it and felt the cabin resist and hold. She felt the quality of Tom's construction in the way the walls did not flex, in the way the properly chinked gaps kept the interior sealed against the wind's attempts at entry. It was a well-built cabin. She had understood this from the first night she had spent in it, but she understood it differently now that she knew more of the man who had built it, and understood that the quality of his construction was the direct expression of the quality of his character, that a man who builds carefully because he takes seriously the things he is responsible for. She turned from the window and began making dinner. Outside, the world was disappearing into white. It was the knocking they did not expect. The storm had been running for perhaps 4 hours, the darkness outside total, and the wind at a pitch that made the air itself seem solid when the sound came at the door. Clara heard it first, a fist against wood that was almost lost in the storm noise, and she was still for a moment before she looked at Tom. He had heard it too. He was already at the door. What came in with the wind was 5 people, and then 3 more behind them, and then 2 more bringing up the rear, with their coats nearly torn from their bodies by the force of the storm behind them. They came in stumbling and half-blinded, crusted with ice, the kind of cold in them that has gone past shivering into the deeper and more dangerous stillness of bodies that have been fighting the temperature for too long. Clara was already moving before the last of them was through the door, already calculating what needed doing and in what order, because this was what she did. This was the specific and non-negotiable function of the person she had built herself to be. She recognized them. She recognized them in the same moment that the warmth of the cabin began to reach their faces and their expressions came back into focus, and the recognition landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of it moving outward in every direction at once. Mrs. Halverson, whose sharp intake of breath on the morning of September had been the sound of someone else's disaster providing interest. Old Cyrus Beale, who had shaken his head with the solemn confirmation of his pre-existing beliefs. Hattie Drummond and her daughter, who had whispered and glanced. 3 men she knew from the wagon train, and behind them 2 women whose names she had to pull from a memory she had been deliberately keeping closed. 10 people. 10 people from the wagon train that had left her at the edge of Frost Hollow in September, who now stood in her cabin, dripping ice and fighting to breathe. The silence in the room lasted perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Clara felt every single thing she was entitled to feel. She felt the September morning in her body, like a physical return the note on the wheel, the 37 pairs of eyes, the deliberate unkindnesses, and the small cruelties, and the particular corrosive pity that is sometimes the worst of them all. She felt the 37 days of the lean-to, the cold, and the aloneness and the specific pride she had built in that aloneness that she had needed to survive it. She felt all of it arrive at once, and she stood in the center of her own kitchen and held it, because she was Clara Hale, and she did not put her feelings down until she was ready. She was not ready to put them down yet, but she was also standing in her cabin with 10 people who were suffering the effects of serious cold exposure, and suffering brooked no waiting while feelings were processed. She moved. She went to the stove, and she built the fire higher without asking Tom, because she knew the stove, and she knew what it could sustain. And behind her, she heard Tom moving the people further into the room, away from the door, toward the heat. She put the largest pot on with water because warmth from the inside matters as much as warmth from the outside. And she went to the supply shelf and began pulling what would be needed, broth and the dried stews, and the additional reserves she had insisted on adding that afternoon, the margin she had wanted. That was now the margin that would make the difference. She worked for perhaps 15 minutes. In this way, her back to the room, the fierce, focused industry of her, keeping her hands steady and her mind clear before she turned to assess the situation. Mrs. Halverson was nearest the stove, her color coming back, but her hands still showing the waxy quality that needed watching. Old Cyrus was seated against the wall with his eyes closed, and his breathing labored in a way that concerned her. Hattie Drummond's daughter, a girl of perhaps 16, was weeping quietly into her own knees. The 3 men had the look of people who had been navigating by pure determination and had used the last of it getting through the door. Clara looked at all of this with the clear cataloging attention she had trained her whole life. Then she turned her gaze to the room itself, the space available, the resources present, the specific needs of 10 cold and frightened people in a 2-room cabin in the middle of the worst storm the territory had seen in years. She straightened to her full height. She felt it happen, the particular physical statement of a body that has found its ground and is standing on it without apology. When she spoke, her voice was not raised. It did not need to be raised. It carried in the way that voices carry when they come from a place of complete authority, not borrowed or performed, but earned specifically, and in this specific place. She said, "My roof, my rules." The room went still. She let it be still for a moment. She looked at each face in turn, not with cruelty, and not with the small personal satisfaction she might have expected to feel, but with the clear authority of a woman who has built something real and is responsible for its continuation. She said, "Every one of you is going to live through this night, but not if we sit here and wait for it to happen. If you can stand, you will chop and stack wood from the pile outside before the entry berries. If you can sit, you will mend every piece of gear in that corner pile, because we will need it all working when this storm breaks. If you are injured or too cold to move, you will sit at the stove and drink what I give you, and you will not argue about it. Is that understood?" The silence held for another moment. Then one of the men, a broad-shouldered farmer named Gareth Cole, whom she remembered as a decent man, stood up. He said, "Where is the axe?" She told him. He went. The others followed those who could in the particular way that people follow clear direction when they are frightened, and the direction is obviously right. Hattie Drummond sat at the table and took up the mending with hands that were still shaking. Her daughter moved to help. Mrs. Halverson, recovered enough, went to assist with the broth. Clara moved through the cabin, managing all of it, checking on Cyrus, whose breathing was her main concern, adjusting the stove, overseeing the broth, ensuring the wood operation outside the door was proceeding without anyone staying in the cold too long. She was everywhere that was needed, and she was never frantic, because frantic was a state she had no use for and had declined to inhabit since September. Tom worked at her side through all of it, or at her back, or across the cabin from her, always where he was most useful, never directing the operation she was running and never undermining it, trusting her command of the room with the full and unqualified trust of a man who has learned exactly what the person beside him is capable of and has stopped wasting energy on anything other than supporting it. When she needed him, he was there. When she had it, he stepped back. This was the shape of what they were together, and she felt it now in the emergency of it, with a clarity she had not needed to feel it with before, when the stakes were lower and the ordinary shape of their days was enough. Cyrus was the crisis point that came at midnight. He had been declining through the evening, his breathing becoming more labored, and his color remaining wrong in the way that she had been monitoring and fearing. She had kept him near the stove and kept the warm broth going and talked to him at intervals, keeping him present and awake, because sleep in this condition was a risk she was not willing to take. But at midnight she went to him and found him struggling in a way that required immediate action. She did not hesitate. She knew what she was looking at from her mother's instruction and from the experience of frontier life, which is a thorough, if brutal, medical education. She told Tom what she needed: a specific configuration of blankets, and the warmest position relative to the stove, and the particular preparation of the herbs she had stored for respiratory conditions, and she worked on Cyrus for the next 2 hours with a focused and intimate concentration that shut out everything else in the room. The room let her. The 10 people who had mocked her and pitied her and read her husband's note without turning away sat in her cabin and watched Clara Hale work to save a life, and they were quiet with it, the good quiet of witnesses to something that exceeds their previous framework for understanding the person they are watching. At 2 a.m, Cyrus's breathing eased. Not resolved, not safe, but eased enough that she could step back and assess him with the cautious optimism of someone who had made a serious problem smaller and intended to make it smaller still. She stood up from her knees beside his chair, and she put her hands on the back of the chair for a moment and breathed. She was aware of the room behind her, of its particular quality of attention. She was aware of Mrs. Halverson's hand coming to her mouth. She was aware of Hattie Drummond making a sound that was almost inaudible, a soft exhalation of relief and something more complicated than relief. She was aware of Tom behind her and to her left, present in the specific way he had been present through the whole night, steady and available, and never in her way. She turned from Cyrus and looked at the room, and what she saw in those faces she had last seen in September was not the thing she had spent months imagining she might see there. She had imagined she might see shame, and some of it was there. She had imagined she might see gratitude, and that was there also. But what she had not imagined, and what she saw most clearly, was simply recognition. The recognition of people who now understood something about her that they had failed to understand before, understood it not because they had been told, but because they had watched it with their own eyes in the most unambiguous possible circumstances. She did not make a speech about it. She was not made for speeches. She looked at them for a moment and let them look at her, and then she said, "The wood needs rotating. The pieces closest to the stove need to come out, and the outer stack needs to come in to dry." Gareth Cole stood up immediately. 2 of the other men went with him. Clara went back to the stove. The storm ran for 3 full days. In those 3 days the cabin became a world of its own, contained and pressurized, and stripped to essentials, in the way that emergencies strip everything down to what is actually real. People showed what they were made of, as they always do when the normal protections of ordinary life are removed. Some showed better than Clara had expected. Some showed exactly what she had always known they were. Mrs. Halverson worked without complaint through the entirety of it, cooking and mending and managing the younger people with a competence that Clara had not previously had occasion to observe. Gareth Cole was steady and capable and did exactly what was needed without being told twice. Hattie Drummond's daughter turned out to have a gift for keeping Cyrus calm and conscious through the night hours, sitting beside him and talking quietly, a kind of patient tenderness that Clara noted and was grateful for. Tom moved through it all like the foundation of the place, which was what he was. He repaired the shutter that threatened to give way on the second night with Clara holding the lamp and the wind trying to take them both off the porch, working in the dark and the cold, with a precise and focused competence that she watched from 18 inches away, and felt in her chest as something that was by now familiar and was not diminishing with familiarity, but deepening. On the second night, when the cabin had settled into the exhausted quiet of people who have been running on necessity and are finally briefly still, Clara found herself sitting beside Tom at the table after the others had found their sleeping places. The lamp was low and the stove was steady, and the storm outside was a constant roar that had become almost like a silence through its constancy. He looked tired, the specific tiredness of a man who has been at full capacity for 2 days and is not complaining about it, but is not concealing it either. She had learned over these months that Tom did not conceal things from her. It was one of the things she trusted most about him. She said, "You let me run it." He looked at her. He said, "It was yours to run." She considered this. She said, "Some men would not have seen it that way." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Some men have not paid attention to you the way I have." She looked at him across the low lamp in the exhausted quiet of the second night of the storm, with 10 people asleep around them in various attitudes of survival, and she felt the full truth of what he had said settle into her without resistance, because she was too tired to resist it, and because she did not actually want to. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. He turned his hand and held hers. They sat that way for a while, not speaking, listening to the storm try and fail to find its way into the cabin he had built to last, and it was enough. It was, she thought, exactly enough. Cyrus turned a corner on the morning of the third day, his breathing clear and his color returned, and his eyes carrying the specific brightness of a man who has come back from a far place and knows it. He looked at Clara when she checked on him, and he said with the stripped-down directness of a man who has recently been close to not existing, "I owe you my life, Mrs. Hale." She said, "You owe me a full recovery, Mr. Beale. Don't make me do that work twice." He almost smiled. She went back to the stove. The storm broke on the afternoon of the third day with the same abruptness it had arrived, the wind dropping the sky, clearing to a blue so sharp and clean it looked like something new, like the sky had been remade in the storm and delivered better than it had been before. The temperature was still savage, but the quality of it had changed, the attack of it gone, the cold now simply a fact to be managed rather than a force actively seeking to end things. Clara stood in the cabin doorway and looked out at the world the storm had left behind, the valley buried in white, the light on it extraordinary, every surface catching the late afternoon sun and throwing it back in 1,000 different directions, so that the world appeared to be made entirely of light and shadow with nothing in between. It was, by any honest measure, one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. Tom came to stand beside her. They stood in the doorway together, the warmth of the cabin at their backs and the brilliant cold world in front of them, and Clara felt the particular and uncomplicated satisfaction of having kept what she was responsible for alive through the worst the winter had offered, and the satisfaction was clean and complete and entirely hers. Behind them, the people she had kept alive were beginning to stir with the cautious optimism of survivors assessing the aftermath. She could hear Mrs. Halverson's voice and Gareth Cole's quiet instructions to the younger men, and the sound of Cyrus Beale's steady breathing, which was the best sound in the room. She was aware that these 10 people would be telling the story of these 3 days for the rest of their lives. She was aware that the story they would tell was not the story of Edmund Whitlock's note on a wagon wheel. She was aware of this without triumph and without vindication, because she had not saved them to prove something, and she had not led them through the storm to settle a score. She had done it because it was necessary, and because she was the person best equipped to do it, and because the alternative was people dying in a place she was responsible for, and none of those reasons had anything to do with September. But she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that September had been present through all of it quietly, a witness to its own overturning. She was honest enough to feel the significance of that without making more of it than it was. She looked out at the brilliant white valley, and she breathed the clean, cold air, and she stood shoulder to shoulder with Thomas Hale, and she was fully and completely herself, and she was without reservation exactly where she was supposed to be. The days following the storm had a quality unlike anything that had come before them. A hushed and luminous quality, the way the world feels after something enormous has passed through it, and left everything both diminished and clarified. The snow lay deep across the valley of Frost Hollow, 4 feet in the open meadow, and drifted higher against the north-facing structures, and the work of digging out was substantial and consuming, and required every able-bodied person in the cabin to contribute to it for the better part of 2 days. Clara organized it. She did so without being asked and without preamble, because the work needed organizing, and she was the person who could see most clearly what needed doing and in what sequence, and the 10 people who had sheltered in her cabin had spent 3 days watching her operate and were not inclined to argue with the results. Gareth Cole and the 2 younger men she set to clearing the barn access first, because the cattle had been confined for 3 days and needed tending with urgency. Hattie Drummond and her daughter she put to work clearing the cabin entry and the path between the cabin and the woodpile. Mrs. Halverson, who had demonstrated over 3 days a capability for steady, useful work that Clara had not previously credited her with, she kept inside managing the cooking and the continued care of Cyrus Beale, who was recovering with a stubbornness that Clara found she respected. Tom worked the heaviest sections, the drifts against the barn's structural walls, and the buried access to the secondary storage, and he worked with Clara beside him when the labor required 2 people, and alone when it did not, and between them they accomplished in 2 days what might reasonably have taken 3, which was the arithmetic of 2 people who know how to work together applied to a straightforward problem of snow. By the evening of the 2nd day after the storm, the ranch was functional again. The cattle were tended and settled, the paths were cleared, the supplies were assessed and found adequate, and the cabin held 11 people, and 2 of them who had been born into ease, and were somewhat surprised to discover they were capable of sustained physical work alongside those who had always known nothing else. Cyrus Beale sat by the stove on that 2nd evening with a cup of broth and a color that was almost normal, and watched Clara move through the cabin with an expression of quiet and undemonstrative attention. When she passed near him, he said without looking away from the stove, "I want to say something to you." She stopped. She looked at him. He was an old man, and he had been honest with himself during 3 days of forced proximity to his own possible death, and honesty of that quality has a way of rearranging a person's priorities. He said, "I stood at that wagon wheel in September, and I read that note, and I did not say one word in your defense, not one word." He paused. He said, "I have been telling myself since then that it was not my business. That is not the truth. The truth is that I was a coward, and I should have spoken, and I did not, and I am sorry for it." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The old wounds were there, as they always would be, because wounds do not disappear simply because the wound site has healed over. But she looked at this old man, who had almost died in her cabin, and who was now offering her the only thing he had left to offer, which was the unvarnished truth about himself, and she felt something that was not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness is a complicated architecture that cannot be built in a single conversation, but was the material from which forgiveness is eventually constructed. She said, "You are alive, Mr. Beale. Spend the time well." He nodded. He looked back at the stove. She moved on. The survivors began leaving on the 3rd day after the storm, as the temperature moderated enough to make travel possible, and as the business of their own interrupted lives called them back to wherever they had been going when the storm caught them. They left in small groups, Gareth Cole's group first, with the horses they had managed to stable in Tom's barn, then Hattie Drummond and her daughter on the horse they had brought, then the remaining 3 men together. They left with their lives, and with the additional supplies, Clara pressed on each of them for the journey, because sending someone out into the Montana winter without adequate provision was not something she was willing to do regardless of history, and they accepted these provisions with a gratitude that was specific and genuine, and in several cases wordless, which was the most genuine kind. Mrs. Halverson was the last to go. She stood in the cabin doorway with her coat and her restored supplies, and she looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who has been doing a sustained and uncomfortable accounting of herself. She said, "You are not what I thought you were." Clara said, "I know what you thought I was." Mrs. Halverson held her gaze. She said, "I was wrong. About all of it." She paused. "She left him, you know, the Fenn widow, before the first snowfall, went back east." Clara looked at her steadily. Something moved through her at this information. Something she examined with the careful honesty she applied to all significant things. It was not satisfaction, or not only satisfaction. It was something more complex. The particular feeling of a prediction confirmed that you had never wanted to make, because its confirmation required that something had gone exactly as badly as you feared it would for someone who had made a ruinous choice. She said, "I hope she found better circumstances in the East." Mrs. Halverson blinked. She had expected Clara understood something harder than this, something with more edge to it, more of the personal satisfaction that the situation might seem to warrant. She had perhaps expected the version of Clara that the note on the wagon wheel had implied a woman made smaller by what had been done to her, a woman whose responses were organized around the wound. Clara was not that woman. She had not been that woman for a long time, if she had ever been her at all. Mrs. Halverson reached out and took Clara's hand in both of hers, the hands that were large and calloused and wore the leather gloves that fit them exactly, and she held them for a moment with a grip that communicated more than her words had managed. Then she let go, and she walked out into the white morning, and Clara watched her go from the doorway until she was a small, dark figure against the immensity of the snow-covered valley. Then she went back inside and began the work of restoring the cabin to the order of 2 people rather than 12, which was a considerable undertaking and a deeply satisfying one. It was 4 days after the last of the survivors had gone, in the particular quiet of a cabin returned to itself, that Edmund Whitlock arrived. Clara was outside when she saw him coming, working at the drainage channel she had been excavating before the storm interrupted the project. The ground workable again now, with the moderate temperatures, and her frustration with the interruption channeled productively into the labor. She was knee-deep in the trench, her boots solid in the thawing earth, her shoulders moving with the rhythm of the work, when she looked up and saw the figure coming across the meadow from the south. She knew his walk before she could see his face. She had walked beside that walk for 11 years, had matched her pace to it, and anticipated its rhythms, and known from the quality of it on any given day what kind of evening would follow. The body holds information that the mind sometimes tries to refuse, and her body knew Edmund Whitlock's walk from 300 yards away and sent her a signal that she received and noted and set aside because it was information and not instruction. She climbed out of the trench. She stood beside it with the shovel in her hands, and she watched him come. He looked diminished. That was the accurate word for it. He was thinner than September, and his clothing, which had always been his particular pride, was in poor condition, worn through at the elbows and patched badly at the knee. He wore the look of a man who had spent 6 months being educated by consequences and had found the curriculum punishing. He was walking with the careful gait of a man who is not entirely sure of his welcome and has prepared a case for himself. He stopped 10 yards from her. He looked at her, and she saw in his face the specific disorientation of a man confronted by a version of something he had dismissed that has become in his absence something he cannot easily dismiss. She was not the woman who had stood at the wagon wheel. She was not smaller or broken, or softened into a form that would be easier for him to approach. She was standing in her own ground with her own tool in her own hands, and she was looking at him with eyes that held no particular feeling about his arrival, which was perhaps the most disorienting thing of all. He said her name. He said Clara. He said it with a particular inflection, the inflection of a man calling towards something he left behind and is hoping to find still waiting. She said nothing. He began to speak. She listened to him speak the way she listened to weather, with the full and analytical attention of someone assessing conditions. He said he had made a terrible mistake. He said he had understood this before winter was properly underway. He said that the widow Finn had returned east, that he had been living rough through the winter, that he had heard of her survival and of the ranch and of the storm and of what she had done in it, and that he had come because he wanted to make things right between them, because he believed they had something worth salvaging, because he had realized in his absence what she had always been to him. He was a better speaker than he was a thinker. Edmund Whitlock. He had always had the gift of language in the service of the immediate need, a fluency that could make the expedient sound like the heartfelt. She had admired it once early in their marriage, before she had learned to listen below the language for what it was covering. She listened below the language now. She heard a man who was cold and hungry and had nowhere particular to go, who had heard of her survival and drawn from it the conclusion that she was a resource available for reconsideration. She heard a man who had reduced her once to a note on a wagon wheel and was now attempting to reverse that reduction, not because he had understood its cruelty, but because the alternative to reversing it was a winter with no shelter and no prospects, and Clara was now known in the valley as a woman with a solid ranch and the skills to keep it. She heard all of this clearly as she had ever heard anything, with the full and unobstructed understanding of a woman who no longer had any investment in hearing something other than what was actually being said. She waited until he had finished. She stood in the thawing Montana earth with the shovel in her calloused hands and the late winter sun finding her broad shoulders and the solid, undefeated architecture of her, and she looked at Edmund Whitlock with eyes that were perfectly and genuinely calm, and she waited for the silence to settle completely before she spoke. She said, "You're lost, mister." He blinked. He opened his mouth. She said, "Let me be specific so there is no confusion between us. The woman you knew is gone. The woman who mended your coat and set your snares and packed your wagon and endured your assessment of her without response, she is not here, and she is not coming back. She made her accounting and closed that ledger in September, and it is not a ledger that reopens." He said her name again differently this time, with less performance in it, and more of the actual uncertainty underneath. She said, "My name is Clara Hale. I'm standing on my land working my drainage channel on my ranch. You are a stranger to me, and you are standing where I need to work." She saw in his face the moment when he understood that she meant it, not the moment when he had decided she might mean it and was calculating the approach that would change her mind. The moment when he genuinely understood that there was no approach, that the thing he had come back for had ceased to exist in the form he remembered and had become something else entirely, something that had no relation to him and required nothing from him, not his approval or his revised assessment or his belated recognition of her value. That moment was in its quiet way the most significant moment of the past 6 months, more significant even than the storm and the survivors and the gloves on the table and the morning at the window with Tom's hand over hers. Because that moment was the moment of completion, the moment when the last of the weight that September had placed on her was lifted not by being confronted or defeated, but by being rendered simply irrelevant, which is a more absolute resolution than confrontation ever produces. She felt it happen in her body, a lightness in the chest, a straightening in the spine, a quality of breath that had been slightly constrained for 6 months, releasing into something full and easy. She turned away from him. She picked up her shovel. She went back to her drainage channel. She heard him stand for a while. She heard the particular quality of a man's stillness when he is trying to find the next move, and discovering that the situation has no next move for him. She did not look up. She worked, and she let the work be its own statement, which was the most honest statement available. She heard him leave. She tracked the sound of his retreating steps across the meadow without lifting her eyes from the ground she was working, and she did not watch him go, because looking back, she had decided in September was a luxury she had given up. She was still in the drainage channel 20 minutes later when Tom appeared at its edge. He had been in the barn when Whitlock arrived and had seen the approach from the barn door and had stayed where he was because he understood without being told that this was not a situation in which Clara Hale required or wanted assistance. He understood this because he had been paying attention for 6 months. He looked down at her from the channel's edge. He said, "He is gone." She said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You all right?" She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. She said, "Yes." She paused. She said, "Better than all right." He nodded. He looked at the drainage channel and assessed her progress. He said, "The grade on the south end wants adjusting." She said, "I know, I was getting there." He picked up the second shovel that was leaning against the pile of excavated earth. He dropped down into the channel beside her. They worked together in the thawing ground of the late Montana winter without speaking, two people beside each other, doing necessary work, and the silence between them was the best kind of silence, the kind that needs nothing added to it, because it is already complete. Spring came to Frost Hollow the way spring comes to that country, not gently and not all at once, but in hard-won increments each warm day, a negotiation with the cold that was still technically in charge, but losing its grip by degrees. The snowmelt ran strong and clear in the creek, and the drainage channel Clara and Tom had completed performed exactly as she had designed it, carrying the meltwater efficiently away from the barn's foundation and down the grade toward the lower meadow. And when Tom checked it after the first big melt and came back to the cabin, he said, "Your mother knew her drainage." Clara said, "My mother knew everything useful." He said, "You know everything she knew." She looked at him across the cabin. She said, "And some things she didn't." The look that passed between them at that was brief and private, and contained in its brevity and its privacy the entire accumulated weight of 6 months of careful, honest, unhurried becoming. The cattle came through the winter at 31 of 32, the loss being an older animal whose condition had been precarious before the storm and who had not survived the sustained cold of the worst 3 days. Tom grieved this loss in the specific, contained way he grieved things, acknowledging it without drama and filing it in the ledger of the season's accounting and moving forward, because moving forward was what the work required, and he was a man who did what the work required. The spring brought the structural projects Clara had planned since February. The barn drainage was finished, the east fence post was replaced, and the surrounding section reinforced. 2 new sections of corral were added to expand the cattle's usable spring pasture. The secondary storage structure was rebuilt from the ground up. Clara, having identified the original design as fundamentally inefficient in its use of the space, and the new structure was significantly more practical, which Tom acknowledged by spending a long moment looking at it when it was complete and then saying with the economy that was his natural register, "Should have built it this way the first time." Clara said, "You didn't have me the first time." He turned to look at her. She was already walking back toward the cabin, and she was smiling a full and unguarded smile that she did not restrain or measure, because she had been in the business of restraining and measuring her smiles for too long, and she had decided somewhere in the thawing of that spring to stop the practice entirely, and the smile felt on her face the way the right tool feels in the hand, exactly what it was supposed to be, fitting perfectly. Nell Pratt came to visit in April, riding out from wherever the wagon train had eventually settled with the shy boldness of a young woman who has been wanting to do something and has finally found her courage. She arrived at the ranch on a morning when Clara was at the corral fence assessing the young heifer that had lost the hoof ice in January, now fully recovered and visibly thriving, and she stopped her horse at the fence and looked at Clara for a moment before she said anything. She said, "I heard what you did in the storm. Everyone has heard." Clara looked at her. This was the girl who had pressed dried beans into her hands in September and said quietly that what Edmund had done was a wicked thing. Clara had thought of her occasionally through the winter, had thought of the small act of courage that the girl had managed when the adults around her had managed none. She said, "Get down from that horse and come inside. There is coffee." Nell got down. They sat at the table, the two of them, and Clara poured coffee, and Nell looked around the cabin with the wide attention of someone seeing a life that is substantially different from what she had imagined for it in September. Nell said, "You look different." Clara considered this. She said, "I am different." Nell said, "You look like someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in some time." Tom came in from the barn while Nell was still there, and he poured his own coffee and sat at the table with them, and the three of them talked about the winter and the storm and the spring work and the valley, and Clara watched Tom talk with the girl with the patient. Courtesy he extended to everyone he considered worth his time, and she felt the specific warmth of watching a person you know well operate in a new context and finding that they are, as you expected, but are still glad to confirm exactly themselves. Nell stayed for the midday meal and left in the early afternoon with the provision that she was welcome back whenever the road was reasonable, which she took seriously and acted on several times that spring, becoming a presence in the ranch's life that Clara found she valued more than she had anticipated, the young woman's straightforward admiration, a different and uncomplicated thing from the recognition of the storm survivors less weighted with its own prior history. It was an evening in late April, one of the first evenings warm enough to sit outside after the supper work was done, that Tom finally said the thing that had been present between them in various forms for the better part of 6 months. They were sitting on the bench outside the cabin's south-facing wall, the one Clara had built and placed specifically for the south light, and the view of the meadow, which was beginning to show the earliest green under the retreating snow. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, and the light it left behind was the particular gold of a Montana spring evening, the kind of light that makes the world look like its best version of itself, like everything hard that produced it was worth the producing. Tom was quiet for a while in the way he was quiet when he was working toward something. She knew this quiet now as well as she knew any of his other expressions could distinguish it from his working quiet, and his tired quiet, and his contented quiet, and she let it be what it was without filling it. He said, "I want to tell you what I see when I look at you." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the meadow the way he often approached the things that mattered most to him, slightly sideways, the frontal approach being sometimes too direct for the size of what he was carrying. He said, "When you came to that lean-to in the fall, I had been watching you for 2 weeks. Every other person in that wagon train looked at the situation you were in and saw a woman who had been left and who would not last the season. That is what they saw, because that is what they were looking at." He paused. "I was looking at something else." She waited. He said, "I was looking at the angle of your axe swing. I was looking at the way you assess the lean-to site, the drainage, and the wind exposure, and the sight lines. I was looking at a woman who had been handed the worst possible circumstance and had turned her full intelligence on it and was solving it piece by piece in the correct order." He paused again. "I had never seen that before, not from anyone, man or woman." Clara was very still beside him on the bench. He turned to look at her then. He looked at her directly with the full attention that she had come to know as his most genuine expression, the look of a man who is not performing but is simply present entirely and without reservation. He said, "They called you a rough stone, Clara. The note on that wheel, the whispers, all of it. They looked at you and they saw something unfinished and inconvenient, something too large for their purposes." He reached out and took her hands in both of his, her large, rough, calloused hands in his, and he held them with the specific and unambiguous care of a man who knows exactly what he is holding and its precise value. He said, "I looked at you, and I saw the bedrock, the thing that everything else is built on and cannot be built without, the thing that holds." Clara looked at him. She felt the full weight of this, not the pleasant lightness of a compliment received, but the actual weight of being truly seen in the most specific and accurate way, the way that required someone to have paid genuine and sustained attention to the real shape of who you are, rather than the shape they found convenient. She had been waiting her whole life to be looked at that way. She had stopped believing it was possible in September. She had begun slowly and with appropriate caution to revise that conclusion over the winter. And here was the revision complete and unambiguous in the voice of a man she had learned to trust more absolutely than she had trusted anyone, because he had earned it with 6 months of absolute consistency. She said, "Tom." He said, You never have to look down again. She looked at him in the gold evening light of the first warm Montana spring she had ever spent on ground that was hers, with the meadow greening below them, and the cattle moving at the pasture's edge, and the barns solid and well-drained behind them, and the cabin warm at their backs. And she let everything she had been carrying about the September morning, and the wagon wheel, and the 37 witnesses, and the lean-to, and the walk north in the dark. She let all of it exist exactly as it was, because she would not pretend it had not happened, and she would not diminish what it had cost her, but she held it now at a different angle, the angle of something that had produced this, that had brought her to this bench beside this man on this evening, and from that angle it looked like the most necessary and formative passage of her life, rather than its defining wound. She was Clara Hale. She had built herself piece by piece from the materials available, which had been mostly hard ones, and what she had built was solid and functional and entirely her own, and she had built it in partnership with a man who had the sense to see what she was before she could fully see it herself, and the patience to wait until she could. She laced her fingers through his. She looked out at the meadow, at the valley of Frost Hollow, going green in the April evening, at the life they had kept alive through the worst winter the territory had offered, and were now watching come back to itself in the reliable and magnificent way that everything that has survived a hard thing comes back to itself. She said, "We need to add another section of fence along the north pasture before the full thaw. The grade will push the runoff into the southwest corner, and the cattle will churn it to mud before July." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was thinking the same thing." She said, "I know you were." He made the sound that was his almost smile, the country adjacent to one, and she had learned by now what his actual smile looked like, and found that she had been right about it from the beginning, that it was worth the wait. She had been right about a number of things she had discovered, including, and especially, the things about herself that she had been most tempted to doubt. She sat beside him on the bench she had built, and she looked at her valley in the gold light, and she breathed the cold, clean air of a Montana spring evening coming in off the snowfields, and she was without qualification or reservation or the particular tax of unresolved wounds content. Not because everything had been easy, not because the passage had been painless or the cost had been anything other than real and significant, but because she had come through it without surrendering the essential thing, the core of who she was, the bedrock of her, and on the other side of the coming through, she had found this a life that was genuinely hers, a partnership that was genuinely equal, a man who looked at her large calloused hands and saw what they had built, and called it bedrock, and meant it. The meadow greened. The creek ran strong and clear in the channel they had designed together. The cattle moved at the pasture's edge with the easy confidence of animals that have been well kept through a hard winter and are now entering the abundance of spring. The ranch at the north end of Frost Hollow stood solid and functional and expanding, built by two people who had found in each other the specific and irreplaceable thing that makes the difference between surviving and living. Clara Hale looked at all of it shoulder to shoulder with the man who had shaken her hand, like a person whose word he intended to take seriously, and she looked at it straight on with her full height and her full strength and her eyes entirely level, and she did not look down.